In this video, we are going to talk about reasonable adjustments and how a failure to make a reasonable adjustment could be discrimination. Unique to the protected characteristic of disability, reasonable adjustments require things to change if a disabled person is at a substantial disadvantage when compared to a non-disabled person. Employers, service providers, educational institutions, landlords and private clubs all have responsibilities to make reasonable adjustments. It is best practice for employers to discuss what reasonable adjustments a disabled person would need to remove disadvantages at work, whereas service providers, universities and colleges and private clubs would have to anticipate adjustments by thinking about how accessible things are or thinking about policies and processes that may present a disadvantage for disabled people. The reasonable adjustment duty is split into three areas. There is a need for reasonable adjustments to be made if a provision, criterion or practice places a disabled person at a substantial disadvantage compared to a non-disabled person. Simply put, a way of doing something creates a disadvantage. Physical features. Often there are barriers like steps, slopes or narrow access points. These can cause significant barriers and a change to a physical feature could be considered as a reasonable adjustment. Where a lack of auxiliary aids or services creates a disadvantage, for example, the provision of a BSL interpreter to facilitate access to face-to-face services. It is important to note that when discussing issues at school or situations involving let premises, there is no right to request reasonable adjustments to physical features. The rights to overcome this exist in other laws, and we would suggest seeking advice on these issues. Examples of problems that could lead to a request for reasonable adjustments include providing speech read software at work, providing ramped access to a shop, providing extra time for an assessment at college, or changing a no dogs policy to allow assistance or medical animals. Discrimination occurs when someone fails to make a reasonable adjustment. There is no specific justification for making an adjustment that would be reasonable. However, what is deemed reasonable depends on a number of factors. For example, an adjustment may be too expensive, significantly impact the ability to provide services, or hinder adjustments already made elsewhere. These factors could all be considered when deciding whether an adjustment is reasonable. We always advocate that you discuss the disadvantage you have faced, identify what would be the best way of adjustments, and request reasons why the adjustment has not been made. The reasonable adjustment duty applies to all situations at work when using services, education, premises and private clubs. However, what may be reasonable for a large company with greater access to finances may not be reasonable for smaller businesses. It is also important to note the time limits for making a complaint of discrimination. Discrimination occurs when a failure to make a reasonable adjustment happens. This is known as the incident date. With work-based issues, you have 3 months minus 1 day to raise a complaint with an employment tribunal. For instance, using services, colleges, universities, private clubs and premises, you have 6 months minus 1 day to lodge a complaint with a county court in England and Wales or with the Sheriff Court in Scotland. Laws around reasonable adjustments regarding common areas of premises in Scotland are slightly different, and we would urge you to seek advice on this specific issue. Remember, the reasonable adjustment duty requires something to change to minimise or remove a substantial disadvantage. Not all adjustments will be immediately obvious, so positive dialogue to discuss the disadvantage can go a long way to rectifying any problems early on. For further advice about the reasonable adjustment duty and how the rest of the Equality Act works, call us free on 0808 800 0082 or visit the website equalityadvisoryservice.com.